Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture and to thank you all for coming. My name is Gregg Mitman, and I am Interim Director of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. There's some seats back in the corner there. So we're honored and excited today to be joined by Susan Hedman, Region 5 Administrator in the Environmental Protection Agency. And we're also grateful to the UW-Madison Law School, especially Professor Steph Tai and Thomas Mitchell, for their partnership with the Nelson Institute on today's event. Before I introduce Dr. Hedman, I'd like to make just a couple of quick announcements about upcoming Nelson Institute events. On March 25th, our third Tales from Planet Earth Film Festival gets underway at venues on campus and downtown. The festival runs through March 31st and will feature more than 30 thought-provoking films and many visiting filmmakers. Green Jobs advocate Van Jones will be our keynote speaker on March 26th at the Barrymore Theater. We're also hosting our 6th annual Earth Day conference at Monona Terrace on April 16th. And this year's conference will focus on issues related to economic growth, sustainability, and happiness. Featured speakers will include a top official from the Kingdom of Bhutan, along with thought leaders in economics, psychology, business, environmental history, and other fields. And you can find more information about these and other events at the table up here where we have brochures, both regarding the Earth Day and Tales from Planet Earth Film Festival, as well as other programs of the Nelson Institute, as well as at our website, nelson.wisc.edu. Now it's my honor to introduce today's speaker. Susan Hedman was appointed by President Obama to be EPA Region 5 Administrator on Earth Day 2010. She directs EPA's operations in the Great Lakes region, which includes Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, as well as 35 federally recognized tribal governments. Her position includes management of the Great Lakes National Program Office, where oversees restoration and protection of the largest freshwater system in the world. Dr. Hedman was previously Environmental Counsel and Senior Assistant Attorney General for Illinois, where she focused on litigation and legislation relating to environmental protection, energy efficiency, renewable energy, carbon capture, and associated consumer issues. Among many other accomplishments, she also served on the faculty of Northland College and the University of Maryland, teaching courses in environmental policy and law, and was a lead counsel at the Environmental Law and Policy Center in Chicago. And in 2000, she moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where she led the legal team for the United Nations Tribunal that handled claims for environmental damage from oil fires in Kuwait and releases of oil in the Persian Gulf resulting from the Gulf War. We're proud that Dr. Hedman is one of our alumni. She earned a PhD in the Nelson Institute in 1989, as well as a JD from the UW-Madison Law School and a master's degree from the La Follette School of Public Affairs. Her talk today is Your Money or Your Life, the false dichotomy posed by EPA's critics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Hedman.
How's that? All right, thanks. Thank you again for the introduction, a very kind introduction. I'm very, very happy to be here today, to be back on campus. I haven't really had a chance to do that very much over the time since I graduated. I was here during the late 70s and some of the 80s, and I spent a lot of time on Bascom Mall. And a few things have changed since then. First of all, I started over in North Hall in what was then called the Center for Public Policy and Administration. That's now turned into the La Follette Institute. And I think it moved up the road a little bit. At Science Hall, I think I'm getting an echo here. Science Hall, at the time that I was here, housed something that was just known as the Institute for Environmental Studies. That has now become the Nelson Institute. And the one thing I can say is at least the law school hasn't changed its name. But it looks very different, and I have to say, wow, quite an improvement over the days when I was here. In addition to all those changes, I have to say that Bascom Hall looks a little different too. This event occurred while I was a student here, and I have very fond memories of it. One thing that hasn't changed is the orange custard chocolate chip ice cream at Babcock Hall. And I have to say for that, I am deeply grateful. When I was a student, I used to go to Badger football games. And I seem to recall that the student section was pretty noisy, even rowdy, lots of yelling. And there was this perpetual tastes great, less filling debate that went on. I thought it was very annoying, frankly. But a lot of people had fun with it. And the fun, of course, is that tastes great, less filling isn't a debate at all. And everybody recognizes the absurdity of arguing about whether a beverage tastes great or is less filling when a beverage could taste great and be less filling. Indeed, the advertising campaign that started that whole taste great, less filling thing counted on consumers to recognize that these two categories are not mutually exclusive. That taste great, less filling is a false dichotomy. Of course, not all false dichotomies are harmless fun. For instance, there are those who claim that we have to choose between a strong economy and a healthy environment. That we have to choose between jobs and clean air, your money or your life. In what sometimes passes for public discourse these days, we can't always count on people recognizing that this dichotomy is false. Especially people being told that the plant where they work will be closed if required to install environmental controls. There are a rather surprising number of people on Capitol Hill who subscribe to this idea that we have to choose between a strong economy and a clean environment. Indeed, the economy versus environment debate has so dominated the 112th Congress that the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee announced that he planned to summon my boss, Lisa Jackson, to the Hill so often that she was going to need her own parking spot. So far, there have been 191 anti-environmental votes during the first session of the 112th Congress. More than one for every day that the House was in session in 2011. In many cases, the public may not have realized that these votes were occurring because these anti-environment votes were often provisions in bills with titles like the Jobs Through Growth Act and something known as the TRAIN Act, which is a rather tortured acronym that stands for Transparency in Regulatory Analysis of Impacts to the Nation. It hasn't always been that way in Washington. When Senator Nelson organized the first Earth Day in 1970, 20 million Americans joined demonstrations across the country, and it catalyzed a broad bipartisan support that led to the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the other major laws that EPA administers. Within a few months of Earth Day, in December 1970, President Richard Nixon, working with Congress, created the Environmental Protection Agency. But today, the political climate is very different. It's more polarized. And there's been an effort to gut environmental protection based on the faulty premise that environmental standards prevent businesses from creating jobs. President Obama rejects this premise, and he made a point of saying so in his recent State of the Union address. The President said unequivocally, "We don't have to choose between our environment and our economy." Those who express a contrary view have focused a great deal of attention on EPA over the past 3 years. And in recent months, most of that attention has been directed at the new Clean Air Act standards that apply to coal-fired power plants. So I'd like to take a few minutes to examine some of the claims that have been made about these new standards to see if those claims hold up. Before we do that, I think it's important to start with some historical context. The Clean Air Act is one of the most successful public health programs in American history, with a return of more than $30 in benefit for every dollar invested in pollution reductions over the life of this law. Indeed, most power plants have invested in modern pollution controls to reduce their emissions. However, a significant number have failed to do so, even though pollution control equipment is readily available and affordable. These tend to be the oldest, dirtiest, and least efficient power plants in the country. And since Wisconsin relies heavily on coal-fired generation, this state, not surprisingly, has both kinds, plants that are relatively well controlled and those that are not. Coal-fired power plants remain the largest source of sulfur dioxide, acid gases, arsenic, and mercury in the United States. So let's talk about mercury. As many of you know, unsafe levels of mercury can be found in many Great Lakes fish. Recently, we've seen some disturbing new data that indicates that after decades of declining mercury levels in fish and wildlife, concentrations are now increasing in some species in some areas. Specifically, we're seeing evidence of increased mercury levels in Lake Superior and Lake Erie fish. And mercury-contaminated fish aren't limited to the Great Lakes. They're in inland lakes, rivers, and streams as well. Wisconsin and many other states issue fish advisories that counsel against the consumption of certain fish, especially by pregnant and nursing women, women who may become pregnant, and young children. A new EPA-funded study of newborn babies in the Lake Superior Basin found that 1 in 10 infants along the Minnesota border of Lake Superior is born with unhealthy levels of mercury in their blood. This is a study that came out in November, presumably because of fish consumption by their mothers. All people, not just women and children, who eat large amounts of fish from mercury-contaminated freshwater lakes and rivers are really at risk. This includes Native American populations and all subsistence fishers and their families. As I noted a few minutes ago, coal-fired power plants are the biggest source of mercury in the U.S. When mercury from power plants reaches water, Microorganisms can change it into methylmercury, a highly toxic form of mercury that builds up in fish. As larger fish eat smaller fish, mercury concentrations increase in fish tissue. Mercury contamination affects populations of many fish species: trout, bass, salmon, and others. Over the years, a number of states, including Wisconsin, have adopted regulations to reduce mercury emissions from power plants, which means most of the mercury entering the Great Lakes and Wisconsin's inland waters is coming from outside of Wisconsin, from the states that don't regulate mercury. And that's just not fair. People who live and vacation in Wisconsin can't eat the fish here because other states haven't been doing their part to solve the problem. Of course, it's really worse than that because a lot of people do eat the fish anyway. And the result is neurological deficits in children. But now that's going to change. In December, EPA finalized the first ever federal mercury standard, which will require all coal-fired power plants in all states to reduce mercury emissions. EPA's new federal mercury and air toxic standard will prevent 90% of the mercury burned in coal-fired power plants, coal burned in coal-fired power plants, from being emitted into the air, which over time will reduce the amount of mercury that ends up in our nation's waterways and in our fish and in our bodies. The mercury and air toxic standard also will reduce power plant emissions of acid gases by nearly 80%. Acid gases cause lung damage and contribute to asthma, bronchitis, and other chronic respiratory disease, especially in children and the elderly. There's been an unprecedented level of support for the mercury and air toxic standard. EPA received over 900,000 public comments on this rule, and the vast majority were in favor of the new standard. Starting in 2016, when most power plants would be required to start meeting the new standard, the mercury and air toxic standards are expected to prevent 4,000 to 11,000 premature deaths each year. And in Wisconsin, the number will be somewhere between 87 and 220 premature deaths, somewhere around the number of people who are sitting in this room. Each year, the mercury and air toxic standard will also prevent about 3,000 cases of chronic bronchitis, 5,000 non-fatal heart attacks, 6,000 emergency room visits, 130,000 aggravated asthma attacks, 420,000 upper and lower respiratory problems, and 3.2 million restricted activity days will be prevented. EPA estimates that the mercury and air toxic standard will yield net benefits of at least $42 billion and perhaps as much as $129 billion each year. That means that for every dollar spent to reduce mercury and air toxics emissions from power plants, that Americans will get $3 to $9 in health benefits. An independent consultant for the Clean Air Council calls EPA's analysis, the analysis that I just presented to you, both comprehensive and conservative, noting that his analysis indicates that the mercury and air toxic standard will, quote, result in an additional $10.5 billion in annual benefits that EPA did not quantify. He identified an additional $8.2 billion in annual benefits, including the avoided costs of lost workdays, health care, and insurance, and the avoided costs of recruiting, training, integrating, and replacing employees who can no longer work due to illness. That consultant, Dr. Charlie Giacchetti, used to be an economics professor here in Madison. In fact, I took several of his courses, And when I was in graduate school, he was on my dissertation committee. So I read this report with interest when I ran across it this past summer. And I assure you, I've not been in touch with him. I believe the last time I saw him, I was cross-examining him in a FERC proceeding at least a decade ago. Nonetheless, I do think this study sheds some additional light on the numbers that we've come up with at EPA. Despite all these benefits, there's been fierce opposition to the mercury and air toxic standards by some owners of coal-fired power plants and lawmakers from coal-producing states. Senator Inhofe, the senior Republican senator on the Senate Environment Committee, says he will try to overturn the rule using a joint resolution of disapproval. Last week, an Ohio-based generator, First Energy, even cited the mercury and air toxic standard as the basis for the company's decision to close 6 of its oldest coal-fired power plants. This is perplexing because the company announced that these plants will be closed no later than September 1st of this year, even though they have up to 4 years to comply with the mercury and air toxic standard. Clearly, the decision to close those plants years before the compliance deadline for the new standard was a business decision that had nothing to do with EPA. While there are pockets of opposition to the mercury and air toxic standard, very vocal opposition in some cases, there are many in the electric sector who have a contrary view. Last year, a number of top executives in the electric sector pointed out in a letter to the Wall Street Journal that power generators have had plenty of time to prepare and install the controls required by the mercury and air toxic standard. You may have seen this statement issued by executives from some of the largest utilities in the country, PG&E, Calpine, NextEra Energy, Public Service Enterprise Group, Austin Energy, National Grid, Exelon, Constellation Energy Group, and others. They said, for over a decade, companies have recognized that the industry would need to install controls to comply with the Act's air toxicity requirements. And the technology exists to cost-effectively control emissions, including mercury and acid gases. Contrary to the claims that the EPA's agenda will have negative economic consequences, our company's experience complying with air quality regulations demonstrates that regulations can yield important economic benefits, including job creation, while maintaining reliability. The mercury and air toxic standards were required by the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. And since then, air toxic standards have been issued for most major source categories, but not for power plants. These standards were long overdue. And in his State of the Union address, President Obama made very clear that this administration will not back down from protecting kids from mercury pollution. Now let's take a look at another new standard designed to limit pollution from power plants in other states. The Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, which is another major target of EPA's critics. Last July, EPA finalized the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule under the Good Neighbor provisions of the Clean Air Act to reduce harmful emissions of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides from power plants located in the states highlighted on this map, including Wisconsin, where those emissions impact particulate and ozone levels in downwind states. The lines on this map show the locations of power plants that impact non-attainment and maintenance of air quality in Wisconsin. And it shows power plants in Wisconsin that impact air quality in other states. Several Wisconsin counties currently violate several of EPA's ambient air quality standards, as do many other areas in the eastern U.S. They violate despite their best efforts to comply because sources in other states impact their air quality. After implementation of the cross-state air pollution rule, EPA models indicate that every single Wisconsin county will meet EPA's current ozone and fine particulate standards. And most of the other non-attainment areas in the eastern U.S. will disappear as well. These air quality improvements from implementation of the cross-state air pollution rule will mean significant public health benefits for the 20 million Americans who suffer from asthma. Asthma is a life-threatening respiratory disease, and the need for action is especially acute in this region, where asthma rates are higher than in the rest of the country. Starting in 2014, each year the cross-state air pollution rule is projected to avoid 13,000 to 34,000 premature deaths, including up to 440 in Wisconsin each year. The cross-state air pollution rule will also avoid 15,000 non-fatal heart attacks, 19,000 cases of acute bronchitis, 19,000 emergency room visits, 400,000 aggravated asthma attacks, 420,000 upper and lower respiratory problems, and will avoid 1.8 million lost workdays and school absences. If we monetize these benefits, they're projected to range from $120 to $180 billion a year. Dr. Cicchetti also prepared a report on the cross-state air pollution rule. He noted that even these staggering numbers substantially understate the adverse regional impacts of interstate pollution transfer, as they fail to consider the resulting economic inequities and losses suffered by downwind states. In particular, higher labor and health insurance costs, lost jobs, lost state and local tax revenue, and higher gasoline prices. EPA's conservative modeling, therefore, actually understates the cross-state air pollution rule's benefits and likely overstates compliance costs. Dr. Cicchetti notes further that under any reasonable set of assumptions, the cross-state air pollution rule's benefits far outweigh its compliance costs. He says each dollar invested in necessary pollution controls avoids $50 to $100 in downwind costs annually. He adds that under highly probable conditions, refining EPA's estimates would likely mean that the cross-state air pollution rule's benefits would likely mean benefits exceed compliance costs by about 100 times. Illinois Senator Dick Durbin summed up the situation this way when I joined him for an event last fall at a pediatric respiratory health unit at a Chicago hospital. He said, "We can set standards that prevent mercury, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide from being released into the air we breathe, or we can spend more money treating chronic health conditions and trying to prevent premature deaths." Power plants covered by the cross-state air pollution rule have a wide range of compliance options. They can improve efficiency. They can improve performance of existing SO2 and nitrogen and NOx pollution control equipment. They can shift load to cleaner units. They can use lower sulfur coal. They can switch fuels. The economics of natural gas conversion are currently quite attractive. They can install or upgrade pollution control equipment such as low NOx burners and scrubbers. They can use previously planned or constructed clean generating sources, or they can simply buy allowances. The goal, of course, is to find the least cost compliance option. And given the number of options available and the flexibility to purchase allowances, I wouldn't be surprised if the actual costs of compliance end up being even lower than some of the most optimistic estimates that we're hearing today. Those of us who were around for the 1990 Clean Air Act debate Remember that industry predicted that the acid rain provisions would cost about $7.5 billion a year. In reality, the actual cost turned out to be around $1.5 billion a year, in large part due to the flexibility afforded by allowance trading. I should point out that the cross-state air pollution rule was to take effect at the beginning of 2012. But it has been stayed in response to a petition for review filed by a group of coal-burning utilities, or I should say electric generating companies, including 4 Wisconsin companies, one of which won't be required to install any new controls to comply with this rule and will have plenty of allowances to sell. The court established an expedited briefing schedule in this case, and oral arguments will be held in April. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, I understand that there are efforts to attach riders to the payroll tax cut extension bills, riders that would attempt to block implementation of the cross-state air pollution rule if the courts rule in EPA's favor. Now let's spend a few minutes talking about carbon dioxide emissions. Last month, EPA released its 2010 greenhouse gas emissions data as reported by 9 major industry groups. This map shows the locations of the major CO2 emitters in Wisconsin. And this chart shows Wisconsin's top 20 CO2 emitters. Wisconsin's power plants, shown in red on this chart, emit 82% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in Wisconsin. When the Chicago Tribune reported similar data for Illinois, the executive director of the Illinois Chamber of Commerce Energy Council made the following comment. It's like a big ship that we can't turn on a dime, but we can create jobs if we do it right. Either we need to gradually shift away from coal, or coal needs to figure out a way to significantly reduce emissions. So the executive director of the Chamber of Commerce Energy Council recognized that environmental standards can drive economic development. And at EPA, we see evidence of that every day. We see evidence that environmental standards do stimulate the economy. Investments in emissions controls create high-quality American jobs to manufacture steel and cement and other materials needed to build pollution control equipment, to create and assemble pollution control equipment, to install pollution control equipment, and to operate and maintain pollution control equipment. This map shows the locations of some of the pollution control companies in the U.S., some of which are right here in Wisconsin. One example is a Wisconsin firm in Baldwin, near Eau Claire, called Northern Metal Fab, and it manufactures air pollution control equipment. The U.S. environmental technology industry is a $269 billion industry and growing. That's why the CEO of the largest electric generating company in the country, Exelon, recently told Congress that postponing the new EPA rules will, quote, delay the creation of new jobs across the country to install pollution controls and build new generation at a time when economic benefits and investment is desperately needed. One thing that's very important about pollution control jobs is that most of them cannot be shipped overseas. In addition, as this chart shows, the U.S. is a leading exporter of pollution control equipment. The Clean Air Act is good for the nation's economy. At EPA, we frequently see evidence of that in enforcement cases. Last year, when we settled the Clean Air Act case with NIPSCO, Northern Indiana utility, The company announced that the power plant modifications required by the settlement would generate more than 1,000 new jobs. And while we're on the subject of enforcement, I'd like to say a few words about Region 5's air enforcement work. The blue dots on this map show Region 5's Clean Air Act settlements in fiscal year 2011. You'll note that most of these settlements are concentrated in areas that do not meet ambient air quality standards. Providing cleaner and healthier air in these areas is one of my top priorities. Since 2005, Region 5 Clean Air Act enforcement cases have required the reduction of 2.5 billion, that's billion, pounds of pollution. Region 5 Clean Air Act settlements since 2008 will result in almost 40 billion in health benefits. The air quality improvements that have resulted from EPA's Clean Air Act enforcement programs have eliminated hundreds of thousands of sick days and thousands of emergency room visits. Enforcement of federal environmental laws such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is largely done by the states with federal oversight. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. Unfortunately, enforcement activity in some Region 5 states, like Wisconsin, has declined sharply in recent years. When that happens, US EPA is forced to handle more enforcement actions, both civil and criminal. And since I know we have a lot of lawyers in the room, I just want to give you an example of the kind of criminal cases that we do. Earlier this year, this former Detroit lead inspector, actually I guess it was last year now, was sent to federal prison for almost 4 years as a result of an EPA investigation. He admitted accepting cash to provide a clean bill of health for homes where he'd either done no lead inspection or provided fraudulent lead removal training. It's a shame that in this day and age we have children with elevated blood lead levels. But we do, and the largest number in the country is in Region 5. So lead enforcement is an area that we will be focusing on a lot in the coming year. In addition to promulgating rules and enforcing the law, EPA works with communities to clean up contaminated properties. There are a lot of these brownfield sites in Wisconsin, and getting them ready to return to productive use can have tremendous economic benefits for these communities. For example, EPA worked with the city of Neenah and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources to develop a former paper mill site, or to redevelop a former paper mill site. The city received approximately $430,000 in American Recovery and Reinvestment Act revolving loan funds in 2009. These funds were leveraged against $700,000 in state funding for the cleanup. In 2010, the first phase of the redevelopment was completed, and the Plexus Corporation, which is an electronics company, opened a new world headquarters at the site, creating 375 new jobs and retaining over 1,200 Plexus jobs in Neenah. The next phase of the redevelopment of this site will involve new office and retail space. Another example of our Brownfields redevelopment work can be seen in the Menominee Valley Industrial Center in Milwaukee. EPA funded work with state and local partners to clean up and redevelop what had been largely just an abandoned eyesore. Cleanup and sustainable redevelopment of the valley has created 1,300 jobs and brought $400 million in private investment. 600,000 square feet of new industrial space has been created, and 45 acres of native planting, which doubles as stormwater management infrastructure, has been installed here. This photo shows Badger Railing, a manufacturer of ornamental iron, one of the businesses that chose to locate in this redeveloped area. Some of the most significant cleanup work the EPA is involved in funding is through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is the largest investment in the Great Lakes in over 2 decades. And I'd like to spend the final few minutes of my time with you telling you about the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and the contribution that it's making to the region's environmental and economic health. President Obama proposed the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative soon after he took office. And in doing so, he gave EPA a new job. That new job is leading and coordinating a multi-agency effort that includes 11 agencies and departments that manage over 140 different programs focused on the Great Lakes. As a result of the new initiative, these agencies, many of which rarely even talked to each other in the past, are working together to tackle threats to the Great Lakes in a comprehensive fashion. And unlike the Clean Air Act issues that I discussed earlier, I'm very pleased to report that there is strong bipartisan support for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative from the entire Great Lakes delegation. One of the priorities of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative is cleaning up the areas of concern around the Great Lakes. The areas of concern were identified in 1987 pursuant to the U.S.-Canada Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement to target locations with the largest legacies of toxic pollution. There are 30 areas of concern located in or partially in the United States. 25 years have passed since these areas of concern were identified. And so far, I'm sorry to say that only one area of concern on the U.S. side of the border has been cleaned up. In other words, in 25 years, we've finished cleaning up only one area of concern. And we intend to change that starting now. EPA is targeting 4 areas of concern where we plan to complete the work required for delisting in 2012. We've also identified 5 additional areas of concern where we believe it's possible to complete all the work necessary for delisting by September 2014. One of the areas of concern targeted for completion this year is in Wisconsin. It's the Sheboygan River area of concern. EPA, along with federal agencies and state and local partners, is implementing the last set of cleanup actions needed for delisting here. These actions include restoration of habitat in 3 separate areas in the area of concern. The restoration work will include in-stream fish habitat improvements, shoreline stabilization, and control and removal of invasive plant species such as Phragmites. There are also 4 major sediment removal projects that will need to be completed in this area of concern. We estimate that we still need to remove over 400,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment from the Sheboygan River. And we've worked hard to put together a funding package that will allow us to complete that this year. We will use Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding, supplemented by 2 Superfund projects and an Army Corps of Engineers navigational dredging project. Unfortunately, I learned this morning that last night the Sheboygan County Board decided not to grant a needed permit for the planned disposal site for a portion of the sediment that needs to be removed from the river. This means we'll have to go back to the drawing board to find a disposal site and a new source of matching funds, because we let the donation of the county's disposal site serve as non-federal match for some of this work. These are the kinds of things that always happen in these complex area of concern remediation projects, but we are still committed to finishing the Sheboygan site by the end of the year. On a brighter note, I'm pleased to report that the Fox River area of concern has been selected as one of the priority watersheds that will be targeted by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative this year to reduce nutrient loading to Green Bay. Of course, nutrients aren't the only problem in this watershed. The Lower Fox River is also a Superfund site, In fact, it is the largest environmental sediment cleanup ever undertaken anywhere. To date, this project has removed 1 million cubic yards of contaminated sediment from the Fox River. And by the way, this PCB cleanup work has created over 1,000 jobs. But the PCBs in the Fox are not the reason this watershed was targeted for special attention by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative this year. The new project will focus on nutrient loading. Nutrient loading from wastewater treatment plants and from agricultural sources. During heavy rain events, which have been happening with increasing frequency in recent years in this region, large quantities of nutrients are flushed into Green Bay. In addition to altering the food web, excessive nutrient loading causes harmful algal blooms and can result in oxygen levels that are too low for fish and other organisms to survive. And since I'm talking about fish, let me mention one final priority of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative: Asian carp, the most acute aquatic invasive species threat facing the Great Lakes. We're fortunate that Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding is available at this critical time to support efforts to control and eradicate this fish. So far, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has awarded $49 million in grants for 88 projects in Wisconsin. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative website has an interactive map that you can use to find out about the wide range of projects in Wisconsin and elsewhere in the Great Lakes region and their contribution to the Great Lakes economy. In closing, I want to mention another major milestone for the Great Lakes. Right now, we're negotiating a revised Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement with Canada, who also happens to be our largest trading partner. This is a particularly high priority for me because in my role as EPA's Great Lakes National Program Manager, I'm head of the U.S. delegation negotiating the agreement. This is an important agreement. It's guided binational coordination of environmental protection efforts on the Great Lakes for the past 39 years. Since the signing of the original agreement in 1972, it has been revised and updated 3 times: in 1978, in 83, and in 87. In 2009, the United States and Canada agreed to renegotiate the agreement because some of the provisions are simply outdated and some other extremely important issues, like invasive species, aren't covered by the agreement at all. I am very pleased to report that the United States and Canada completed the last round of formal negotiations a couple of weeks ago in Ottawa. And we look forward to a signing of the revised agreement this spring. EPA is working extremely hard to help with the President's mission to build an America built to last. An America where a healthy environment is the foundation for a strong economy. I thank you for your attention, and if we have time, I'd be happy to take some questions.